Welcome back, everybody. This is Chapter 7 of the American Pageant, The Road to Revolution. Taking a look at years, 1763 to 1775, post French and Indian War. Some basic things we need to understand about this chapter is that it does start after the 7 Years' War, we call the French and Indian War. This makes Britain the master of North America, but it also leaves them in a crippling debt. Those two generalities we need to know as we walk into this chapter. We're going to be talking about them a little more specifically as the chapter goes on. The chapter kind of opens up with some philosophical ideas, the first being Republicanism. Now, Republicanism is pretty much our social contract as John Locke describes it. Citizens are willing to create a society with government as long as the government takes care of its responsibilities and rights towards the citizens. And the citizens, in turn, are allowed to elect representatives to make decisions for them. And that's the basic idea of republicanism. Now, this is a very liberal idea, a very progressive notion in the fact that, Western Europe still has monarchs and things like that. So republicanism is an idea that the colonists are buying into very heavily. So we need to know that as we move forward. Another idea that's coming out is proposed by a group in England called the Radical Whigs. Now, I kind of call them the conspiracy theorists of the day, but their conspiracy theories aren't as crazy, so to speak, as like maybe flat earthers or hollow earth theory or anything like that today. The Whigs are arguing against that there might be possible corruption in the monarchs and that we should really be taking a look at how we're being governed and giving too much power to an arbitrary king. Okay, now that's crucially important because you add republicanism to the thoughts of the Radical Whigs, and you've got some pretty paranoid, rebellious colonists, because these two things are in stark contrast with the way Britain is going to be governing us through this chapter. Britain has always embraced the idea of mercantilism, and mercantilism isn't that bad of a theory, really. Mercantilism states that the wealth of a nation is determined by its gold and silver, and that a nation should use colonies to have markets and produce raw materials so that they can sell those products and create more gold and silver in their coffers. Now, that's all well and good because it provides the colonies a purpose, it provides them with jobs, it provides them with a solid foundational economy. One part of mercantilism, though, that is in stark contrast with the other two philosophical ideas of republicanism and the Radical Whig theories is that mercantilism doesn't allow for self-sufficiency and self-government. Now, we've learned pretty much all the way up to this point that Britain doesn't really follow that part of it. They allow the colonies to basically be self-sufficient and self-governing. We call this salutary neglect. Salutary neglect is still an important ideology that we need to keep in our mind going forward. Salutary neglect allowed us to become what we are at this point in our study, which is basically a self-sufficient, self-governing entity. That's going to change, though. So these ideologies are going to be in conflict with one another as we go through this chapter. Another way that the colonies benefit from mercantilism is that they're protected. Britain is the largest army in the world, and the colonies are benefited by this. If anything ever pops off in the colonies, they've got the strongest army in the world backing them up. So I want to press that, I'm pretty moderate on Britain. They've been very good to us so far. So mercantilism hasn't negatively affected the colonies. The colonies are, as I've told you, probably the greatest place in the world at this time to live. However, that philosophical idea of mercantilism is going to change, and I'm going to be in support of the American Revolution, 100%. But I don't want you to think that Britain is super bad, because, they're just acting like any other colonial power would do, and up until this point, they've been very good to the American colonies. Now, I told you that we were in, Britain was in a significant amount of debt. That number totals about 140 million pounds during that time, in that time's money. So this is a significant amount of debt, and half of that debt is incurred by protecting the American colonies. So once again, I'm all in favor of the upcoming taxes that are going to be imposed. However, spoiler alert, I guess, it's the no taxation without representation piece of the story that I side with the colonists and think that the American Revolution is aptly justified. The individual that is noted as being kind of in charge of the first taxation pieces and such is George Greenville. He's a new prime minister in England, and he comes up with a new empirical policy which does two different things. Number one, it's to strictly enforce the navigation laws, which have been on the books for a while. Britain just hasn't enforced them. And number two, he decides to pass the first tax. And we call this the Sugar Act. Now, way in the past, we've passed the navigation laws and we've passed the Molasses Acts, but this is the first of the new acts, so to speak, designed to raise revenue to pay for the French and Indian War. That specifically is what this is designed for. They also passed the Quartering Act of 1765. Now, this, to me, is an absolute breach of the social contract, and I do not agree with this one at all. Britain, to me, has no right to pass the Quartering Act. The Quartering Act states that the American colonists should provide housing and foods and supplies for British soldiers. Now, if you're going to tax us, you can't also make us provide defense. That seems to be an unreasonable expectation. That's what taxes are for. So if you're going to tax us, you can't force us to basically pay for the army. That's not how government works. The first major act that you guys probably remember is the Stamp Act. You learned all about this in middle school, and the Stamp Act is another act designed to raise revenue to pay for the war. Now, what this act does is it requires a stamp to be put on legal documents, playing cards, pamphlets, newspapers, diplomas, marriage licenses, etc., paper documents. Now, one thing I want you to understand is that the Stamp Act is only new to us. It's not new to Britain. They are taxing their own people in Britain. Most people aren't fully aware of that. A lot of people have the idea that the colonies are the ones that's getting the bill. Well, everybody in the British Empire is getting the bill. Now, we absolutely resent these taxes because they are new to us. And we've been fighting with Britain in the French and Indian War. We've been doing what we were supposed to do. So we're at a point where we don't understand why we're being taxed so heavily when we've never been taxed like this before. So that creates a lot of resentment and a lot of tension between us and Great Britain. The major hang-up with the taxes for the colonists, and I've already said it and you guys knew it coming in, is no taxation without representation. Now, the Americans believe that they should be taxed by their colonial legislatures because that is their government. The colonists feel that they are not represented in Parliament because they don't vote on people to actually send over there that represents colonial ideologies. Now, Greenville is going to argue against this. He says that the colonists enjoy a state what is called virtual representation because Parliament represents all British subjects. I don't agree with this. we all know that the British Parliament is not going to be the best voice for the American colonies. The colonies have no actual direct representation in Parliament, so I tend to lean towards the side of the Americans, that they do not have representation and that taxation is an absolute breach of the social contract. Now, Britain is obviously going to disagree with that statement, but I think we're aptly justified in saying it. You need to think about virtual representation when you're doing your writings, your LEQs, your DBQs, your short answers. Those are things that definitely need to be put in there. That is a major philosophical, historical ideology that must be discussed and understood. Once the Stamp Act is passed, we have another meeting. And as we've known, we've had some meetings before. We met the Albany Plan of Union, and that didn't work out really too well. But, you know, it's getting there. We're starting to try to unite at that point. And then we have other meetings, and this one is a little better than the others. Okay, we're starting to become more unified. The Stamp Act Congress, there was 9 colonies that were represented, and what they did at the Stamp Act Congress is they discussed, you know, how are we going to react to the Stamp Act? Well, we draw up a statement of our rights and what we want the king to do, and we also decide to start boycotting British products. So this is another step towards colonial unity, and it should be duly noted. Boycotting British products is called Non-Importation Agreements. We decide that we will not purchase British imports, and we're hoping that that would hurt Britain economically so that they would listen to some of our demands and maybe allow us to have actual representation in Parliament. We try to get our people to buy, you know, colonial-made goods and to use bartering systems and things like that so that Britain doesn't raise very much tax revenue. The Sons and Daughters of Liberty are introduced at this point, and they take it a little farther. Of course, they do encourage the boycotts, but they also decide to occasionally tar and feather customs officials, or tax collectors, so to speak. This is kind of the first time we lay hands on each other. So it's historically important to know what these groups did. This actually works. A lot of the Stamp Act tax collectors kind of quit. They don't want to deal with this. They don't want to get tarred and feathered. So basically the Stamp Act is nullified at this point. In '66, the Stamp Act is repealed. And that's kind of our first success. It's not going to be the end of the story, though. This is kind of a cat and mouse game between us and them. They do something, we respond. They do something, we respond. Back and forth, back and forth. So it's not over. But hey, we have a small little victory here, and that probably helps to encourage more colonial unity. So that's an important piece of the story. The British response comes in the name of the Townshend Acts. Now, the Townshend Acts are a new tax that is levied on things like glass, lead, paper, paint, and more importantly, tea. Tea is very important to the American colonists because we still have British customs. The colonists, you know, motherland is basically Britain, obviously, and British people drink tea, and the colonists drink tea. This tax is once again, to the colonists, from their perspective, is a taxation without representation. Now, this is another way for Britain to raise money to help pay off the French and Indian War. So they feel justified in doing this. We feel justified in boycotting it, like I said, for the no taxation without representation piece. The Townshend Acts require collectors to collect the money. And we saw in the Stamp Act that regular tax collectors are not wanting to do this job. So Britain decides to start sending military over to collect the taxes. And this leads to a very famous event in American history called the Boston Massacre. Okay, so the Boston Massacre is caused by the military coming over here. We learned a great deal, I'm sure, about the Boston Massacre when we were young. There was 2 regiments of soldiers sent to Boston to start collecting taxes and things like that. And they're all out in the middle of a large courtyard, kind of town square, so to speak, in Boston. And there are 10 soldiers, and 60 American colonists start surrounding them. They start throwing rocks at them, cursing at them, so on and so forth. Push comes to shove, one of the soldiers gets knocked down. He's hit in the head. So the colonists do this, and the British soldiers fire bullets onto the American colonists. The first person killed is a man by the name of Crispus Attucks. He's an African American gentleman, somebody that we need to know a little bit more about in history. John Adams is introduced at this juncture. He is the defense lawyer for the colonists, and only 2 of the colonists are actually convicted of manslaughter. This shows the power of John Adams and his success as a lawyer. Very, very, very good lawyer at this time. Next, we're introduced to an individual by the name of Samuel Adams. Now, the presentation talks about Samuel Adams as pretty much being a failure at everything he ever tried in life. He failed at business, he failed at blacksmithing, he failed at law, but he's actually a very good politician. He's a pretty smart guy. He's just not really successful, but he is successful at politics. And he forms what's called the Committees of Correspondence. Now, this starts in Massachusetts and Boston. And basically what the Committees of Correspondence was intelligent, rebellious colonials writing letters back and forth to each other, discussing, what Britain's doing to us and how we're supposed to respond to that situation. Now, this doesn't seem like a huge deal, to us, but back then that is how people communicated, and you have the smartest people in the colonies talking about rebellious activities. So the Committees of Correspondence is significant. Eventually, every colony is going to have its own Committees of Correspondence, and once again, that's going to help lead to more colonial unity. I want you to be seeing how we are becoming more unified as time goes on, because that is a very, very important piece of the story. In 73, the British East India Company is given a monopoly for the tea trade in the American colonies, and they decide that they're going to continue with the 3-cent tax on the tea. Of course, this is going to continue to be deeply resented by the colonists, and a very famous American event is going to happen because of this, and that event is the Boston Tea Party. We all learned in middle school, elementary school about the Boston Tea Party, and those facts that we learned are still accurate, and they definitely need to be remembered. The Sons of Liberty dressed up as Native Americans. They got on board British ships in Boston Harbor and dumped tea into the water, destroying the tea. And this cost Britain money. Part of the story that isn't remembered or isn't even taught when you guys are younger is that this is going on all over the colonies. This is happening in Philadelphia, this is happening in New York, this is happening in Maryland, Charleston. So don't think that it's local to Boston. This is going on all over, and once again, that starts to show us colonial unity. Now, obviously, Britain is going to respond to what happens in Boston, because the people in Boston actually destroy British products. It's not just a boycott, it's an actual destruction of British property. So Britain responds with what we call the Intolerable Acts. Now, Britain calls them the Coercive Acts, we call them the Intolerable Acts. I tend to use the term Intolerable Acts because I have an American perspective on this story. The significance of the Intolerable Acts is that it's not passed to raise tax revenue, it's passed to punish the people of Massachusetts. Britain closes their port down with the Intolerable Acts until the tea that they destroyed is paid for. They also take away their local self-government. They're not allowed to have town meetings anymore. And anybody caught breaking these rules were drugged to England and tried in court over there. So these Intolerable Acts really, really cause a lot of conflict and tension between the colonials and the British. Once again, we're going to have another meeting. And these meetings that I keep bringing up are vastly important because this is creating the colonial unity piece that I keep stressing on so heavily. Now, at this meeting, 12 of the 13 colonists are represented, and it's called the First Continental Congress. And basically what this meeting is to decide how we're going to deal with the Intolerable Acts. So once again, we see that cat and mouse game being played. This is, so far, our best attempt at colonial unity, where we've got 12 of the 13 member or state colonies represented there. We decide to draft a Declaration of Rights. We're going to tell Britain what we want. We want to do away with these taxes. We want representation in Parliament. Of course, Parliament's going to reject these, but it shows that we are uniting and we are becoming a country. We're becoming a single entity instead of just 13 randomly placed colonies. We see the shot heard around the world come next, and this is what most historians, most people consider to be the opening shots of the American Revolution, and I won't disagree with that. You could argue that maybe it was the Boston Massacre or perhaps even the tarring and feathering of the Stamp Act Congress, but this is, really the opening of the American Revolution. In 1775, Britain sends troops to collect or to acquire, to take over an arsenal located in Concord. They're going to take the gunpowder, they're going to take the guns, the ammunition, they're going to take that away from us. And they're also there to arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock. Now, we're introduced here to Paul Revere, his midnight ride, one if by land, two if by sea. You learned these things in middle school. This is where Paul Revere comes into the story. Well, long story short, the local militia, or the Minutemen, because they were to be ready in a minute's notice, start to get into conflict with the British Redcoats. This is when somebody fires on somebody. We say they shot first, they say we shot first, but it doesn't really matter. We have fired on them, they have fired on us. The American Revolution has unofficially begun. Now, I say unofficially because, it's going to take, paper documents, the Declaration of Independence and stuff like that to truly make this official. But in all intents and purposes, the American Revolution has begun.